Good evening, and this is my presentation on the last British airliner. Why am I talking about this topic? So some of you may have spotted on the slides that were shared earlier, we had some discussions in the committee as to what event or presenter we would have with our annual meeting this year. And eventually Barry said to me, would you like to present something? And so I said, yes, I could. And I chose a topic of personal interest rather than anything to do with my work. So small disclaimer at the start, I've never worked for either BAE Systems or Honeywell or anyone associated with the production of this aircraft, nor do I hold any kind of pilot's license, so just to manage expectations there. But I first flew when I was not quite 5 years old, and I very much enjoyed the experience, and I was quite fascinated by the things that allowed us to do that. And the following year, a similar holiday again, and this time got my first ever trip on a jet aircraft, which happened to be this one, which is the BAE 146. And at that time, this was a relatively new aircraft. It was from Britain, like me, so it's sort of kind of interesting that we were producing something, and it was being touted as being very low noise. So this was something that was then some kind of step forward compared to previous aircraft. So there you see on the left-hand side a photo which I asked my mother to take with her little camera she had back then in 1989. And then, just like Barry just said, I also found myself traveling on these back and forth quite often, having lived here in Switzerland, going back to London, also on other routes from Zurich and in Germany, because Lufthansa had these as well. And in 2017, they had got rid of the last one out of the fleet from Swiss. And I was on the very last passenger flight. It was actually a kind of enthusiast flight where we did a little trip around Switzerland and a sort of little circuit of the Matterhorn there. And there's a couple of photos there from that flight in 2017. So now I'm going to start the story of this aircraft, really where this came from, why this exists. And actually you have to go all the way back to the 1930s. And there was a very famous aircraft, the Douglas DC-3. It's also known as the C-47 as a military version, or in Britain we call it Dakota. And this was really one of the first sort of modern airliners with all metal construction. It was a low-wing cantilever monoplane. A lot of aircraft up until that point had been biplanes, and indeed biplanes did continue up until World War II, really, as did quite a lot of planes from constructions other than metal. Still a lot of wood being used, a lot of fabric, that sort of thing. So this first flew in December 1935 in California in the USA. Could hold up to 32 passengers, and it had a decent sort of range and payload. So this was really quite a usable aircraft. And it was used a lot during World War II for transporting troops and other freight, and it continued in that role. And really the only thing that really distinguishes this from a true sort of modern airliner really was the lack of pressurization in the fuselage, and the fact we've still got a so-called conventional or tail dragger undercarriage where the aircraft sits slightly nose up when it's on the ground rather than parallel as you get with a tricycle undercarriage of most modern aircraft. And an astounding number of these things were built, over 16,000, including all the military versions. And those that survived World War II, a lot of them were converted for civilian use. And they really went all around the world. Even the Soviet Union had its sort of own copy of this thing. And these were being used quite extensively in the latter 40s and into the 1950s for a lot of passenger routes, relatively short routes. It's also quite sort of rugged aircraft, so could be used in more inaccessible places. And manufacturers during the 1950s, with the advances that had come during and immediately after the Second World War, notably gas turbine propulsion, were looking at how to replace these aircraft. And in the 1950s, quite a lot of manufacturers then adopted a sort of twin turboprop philosophy. And we see three examples underneath. So in the bottom left, the Fokker Friendship from the Netherlands, which about 700 or so were produced. And then in the UK, two different designs here. So in the bottom centre, the Handley Page Herald, that particular one's in the museum. The propeller is missing from the left side, in case you're wondering. And in the bottom right corner there, we have the Orca or Avro 748, which first flew in 1960. And that went on also selling several hundred into the very early 80s. So with that in mind, then I come on now to the de Havilland Aircraft Company, which was located principally in Hatfield in Hertfordshire, just north of London in the UK. We see on the map roughly where it is in the top left, and in the bottom left corner you see there an aerial photo of the site. It had a combined airfield and factory, so the aviation factory side is in the foreground, and then the other side of the runway they developed various other things. On the right hand side we see some of the notable products from this company over the years. So a lot of people, particularly from the UK, may be familiar with the Tiger Moth biplane. In World War II, the very famous Mosquito fighter bomber, which was actually still a wooden construction, known as the Wooden Wonder. Interestingly, the Vampire was one of the first jet aircraft, and actually the fuselage nacelle of that aircraft is also a composite of plywood and balsa. The wings are metal, but still wood being used, into the 50s there on that. And then of course we have the Comet, the first jet airliner. But they also produced things like guided missiles. We have an intermediate range ballistic missile, which was cancelled in 1960, and that became the basis for, I think, one of the Ariane launches. And they produced also their own propellers, their own piston engines, gas turbine engines, and then later on other airliners like the Trident. And then one of their last products was the 125 business jet. And in 1960, they got merged into the Orca Siddeley group. So the government in the UK at the time was trying to rationalise the number of different manufacturers that we had. And when they joined that group, there was already Avro in that group. So there was already a twin turboprop sort of serving this role of a DC-3 replacement. So their own design, the DH-123, was abandoned, and they then looked instead at the next logical development, which would be a pure jet aircraft to replace it. And the initial concept was called DH-126. And this was essentially a scaled up version of the concept for the 125 business jet. And you can see with the graphic in the top left corner there that they tried to very closely match the fuselage size of that aircraft with the DC-3 that it's intended to replace. And you got about the same number of passengers, aiming for sort of 26 to 32 passengers, and different engines that they looked at there. Had a Havilland engine. The engine company, I think, got merged into Rolls-Royce, and then a Rolls-Royce engine, the 172, and then a GE engine. But the economics of this, they couldn't really see that you could make a profitable jet aircraft of this size with the technology that existed at the time. So they then, in the next development, attempted to say rectify that by making use of the fuselage of the 748, which I showed you on the earlier slide, and coming up with a sort of similar size aircraft. Again, roughly similar engines were proposed for it. We see that the dimensions and the weights and so forth of all these designs are growing with a little bit with time. But in the end, they realized that the number of modifications they needed to make, it still didn't really economically make sense. It didn't produce this benefit that they would hope from reusing some of the existing design components in the fuselage. So then they came on to the next concept in the mid-60s here, which is the HS-136, which conceptually, in terms of the layout, is very similar to the Boeing 737, which first came out also in the mid-60s. You can see we've grown a bit there, and we've got a much more modern engine, the RB203 Trent, which never got into production. I think this may have even been one of the first triple spool engines. And now we're aiming at a much larger number of passengers, 60 to 93. But with all of these aircraft, they always assumed they would probably be used in more remote places, and possibly not with hard runways, on sort of unprepared runways and that kind of thing. And as a result, they were concerned about the possibility of foreign object ingestion into the engines, given that they're underslung under low wings. And they did a test with a 125 business jet, where they basically put some wooden frames on the wings with bags kind of in these frames, and ran this over some rough ground to see how many little stones and things that they would collect being thrown up by the nose wheel and that sort of thing. And the answer was quite a few. So they were quite concerned about foreign object ingestion. So they decided not to proceed with this design, and then went away and came back with the 144, where you can see this time they've now moved the engines back onto the fuselage. Relatively far forward, actually, for this kind of design. Typically, if you look at something like Fokker 28 or a BAC 111 or a DC9, the engines are much further back, but for reasons of centre of gravity, they were trying to keep them relatively far forward, and still using the Trent engine. And this would have been the design maybe they would have gone with. And then, unfortunately, in 1970, Rolls-Royce went bankrupt. And so a lot of the engines that were in development at the time then didn't continue unless there was really an airframe that was really going into production with orders behind it. A little aside to this story, not strictly part of this particular gestation, as it were, but on the top right, around the same time, the company was also looking at how one would get into and out of city airports in the future. And also within the Hawker Siddeley group was the Hawker company in Kingston in London and in Dunsfold in Surrey, who were producing the Harrier, the famous vertical takeoff jet fighter. And so they actually looked at producing a vertical takeoff airliner. And this thing would have had in its ultimate configuration no fewer than 18 engines. So you see here 16 RB202 lift engines and 2 propulsive RB220 engines. And they actually got as far as building a special wind tunnel for this and a wind tunnel testing of it. And this would have probably presented tremendous challenges for control, for certification. It probably would have used a lot of fuel, I imagine. It would have been quite noisy, at least locally. The idea was if you could take off vertically, you didn't subject so many people to that noise because your aircraft would ascend and descend over a relatively small area, as opposed to something coming in with a much shallower approach. Nevertheless, again, with the bankruptcy of Rolls-Royce and these engines not going any further, and this was also discontinued. So the final aircraft on this slide is essentially the basis of what actually became the aircraft that is the subject of this presentation, which was HS-146, developed between 1971 and 73. And for the first time, they actually had a fully developed engine for this, the Lycoming 502, which I'll come on to a bit later. And you can see, once again, we've grown in terms of maximum takeoff weight and the number of passengers being carried. The only issue with this engine, that at least did exist, was that with only about 7,000 pounds thrust, it was a bit smaller than what they needed for an aircraft this size. So they ended up with 4 engines. And because of their earlier requirements to be able to operate from rough fields and have the reasonably good short field operation, we've ended up with a high wing, which then brings the engines up away from the ground. And then in order to avoid the jet efflux going straight onto the tail, you end up with a so-called T-tail configuration. And then the oil crisis hit in 1973, and then this project was also cancelled. And there were quite some, I think, some protests and strikes and political to and fro, and eventually the project was then restarted in 1978. So moving on to a technical description of the final design that goes into production, and some of these photographs, or actually most of them, are actually from a more recent version, but basic structure is kind of the same. So the fuselage is a circular section. It's 11 foot 8 inches in diameter, and this is made of aluminium alloy with traditional frames and stringers. Quite extensive use of redux bonding in the aircraft as kind of a 2-part adhesive process that is cured at high temperature, which helps to reduce the number of components that there were in the design overall, and sort of simplify the design. You have the high wing with 15 degrees sweep. So this is probably a lower sweep angle than a lot of other aircraft up until that point in time. So the sweep angle, for anyone who's not sort of familiar with aviation things, is basically the angle between, let's say, a horizontal line here and the leading edge of the wing. So for designs of aircraft flying at higher and higher Mach number, then the sweep angle tends to increase. Disadvantage of that is that you usually end up having to have higher takeoff and approach speeds. So this kind of sweep angle they've adopted here is most likely a compromise between those things, because this cruises at Mach 0.7, which is maybe about 0.12 Mach slower roughly than something like a 737 or an Airbus A320. So it's a little bit slower, but still faster than most turboprops. And we still retain pretty good field performance with it. The wing also features a certain amount of 3 degrees of anhedral. So you can see that it bends down slightly from the horizontal. Basically, the amount of anhedral or dihedral affects the stability of the aircraft in flight. And sometimes you need maybe more dihedral to introduce more stability, and sometimes you have almost too much inherent stability, and then they introduce a certain amount of anhedral. The aircraft has no leading edge high lift devices, so actually they were able to generate sufficient lift on approach just with these large 78% span tab Fowler flaps, which seal all the way to the end of the fuselage, so it's quite an efficient design in that respect. The elevators and the ailerons are actually manual, so they're not hydraulically actuated. You have these servo tabs on the end here, which gives you a kind of mechanical advantage. So eventually the control input deflects this, which in turn deflects the whole aileron, and that sort of gives you the roll control, so the pitch control. The rudder is, however, hydraulically assisted. There were 2 hydraulic systems, the green and the yellow, so there's a kind of double redundancy. And you have these large lift dumpers, or the spoilers on the wings, and this enormous rear air brake, and this and the brakes together basically provided enough sort of stopping force in order that there was no need for reverse thrust on the engines either. So that's sort of 2 things eliminated that you'd find on many other modern civil aircraft. The landing gear here is quite substantial. Again, more designed for the rough field operation, quite softly sprung, quite large fan-assisted carbon brakes. So this basically also allows you to bring the thing to a stop, and the quite soft suspension, as it were, then give you very soft landings, and also assisted the braking efficiency. And then the fuselage diameter that I mentioned before basically gives you quite a large cabin. So typically they were operated with 5 abreast seating or 4 abreast in first class. You could go to 6 abreast and get more seats in, though some operators chose to do that. And lastly here, the cockpit is, at that time, I suppose, relatively modern design. They were moving away from 3-pilot operation in many aircraft. This is only 2 pilots, of course. And the engine control, the engine instrumentation you see here in the center of the panel here, the main flying instruments here, the autopilot, and most of the systems, the fire handles in the overhead panel here, the throttles and the radios and so forth in the center console. So there's no flight navigator station or anything like that. Flight engineer station, sorry. Moving on now to the engine. So this is the Lycoming 502. So this comes from the United States, from Stratford in Connecticut. The core of the engine, that's the compressor, the combustion chamber and the turbines, is actually based on the Lycoming T55 engine, which is the engine used in the Chinook helicopter. So they had the advantage that when they went into production with this, they already had, I think, about 3 million flight hours on the Chinook. So they had quite significant experience already, which is always a good thing. When designing a new aircraft, it's always preferred to have an existing engine, or maybe you add a new engine to an existing airframe, but if everything's new together, it introduces more risk. The engine is twin spool, so you've got essentially 2 concentric shafts that actually rotate in different directions. And one interesting feature this engine has that a lot of engines don't have is this reduction gearbox. So in turbomachinery, we have a concept of turbines, a dimensionless concept of the stage loading, which is a ratio of the enthalpy drop over a stage, which is basically related to the work that the stage does, divided by the tangential blade speed square, the tangential blade speed being a product of the rotational speed and the radius. And for an efficient stage, you want this ratio to be in the range of 1 to 2.5. There's going to be something sort of equivalent for the fan, and we see that the fan is on a much larger radius than the turbine. So in fact, what this gearbox does is it allows the reduction of the rotational speed by a ratio of 2.3 to 1. And not a lot of engines up until quite recently have actually had this. Some turboprops, I think, have a gearbox here. Pratt & Whitney have recently introduced the geared turbofan, which is now on the Airbus A220. But this was kind of I thought, almost unique feature. The bypass ratio of the engine is quite high for the time. So that's the ratio of the mass passing through just the fan to the mass passing through the core. Thrust is a product of the mass flow and the velocity. So you can either move a lot of air quite slowly, or you can move less air very fast. The original turbojets and the low bypass ratio turbofans went that route, but you have a lower fluid efficiency, and you also produce more noise that way. So by having this larger bypass ratio, you're essentially trying to generate more thrust from moving a lot of air less fast. And that was actually one of the great features of this aircraft. It was very low noise. So compared to a lot of the twin-engined jet aircraft of the time, it was much, much quieter. And it was even quieter than many turboprops, because you have a number of sources of noise from the engine. It's not only the flux from the rear, which is sort of caused by the shearing of the dissimilar velocity and temperature flows, but also you can get noise, obviously, from propellers, from fans. Many modern aircraft have transonic fans, so you're going to get shock sounds on takeoff, this sort of buzzsaw sound that you get. But this aircraft was very quiet because of this engine. In fact, the overall pressure ratio is relatively low. It's just 12 to 1. Modern aircraft would probably be 30, 35, 40 to 1, something like that. It's got 7-stage axial compressor, and then you've got a centrifugal stage afterwards. This stage, you can achieve a much higher pressure ratio across a single stage with a centrifugal stage than you can with an axial stage. But I guess, I mean, this engine, probably the core of it was probably designed, I imagine, in the early 60s. They weren't quite so advanced then, so I think the pressure ratio across each individual stage is much lower than it would be today. The combustion chamber is an annular combustion chamber, so no single cans, as you would have seen in earlier engines, or even some of the other engines from this time, from the 60s or so. It's reverse flow, so maybe has a higher pressure loss perhaps than some later engines would have, but it's more compact. This engine was then later developed into the LF507, which had a full authority digital engine control, or FADEC system, which was more advanced than the one on the earlier engine. I think they also changed some parts of the compressor on that as well. So in terms of development of this aircraft, so in 1977, Hawker Siddeley was merged with British Aircraft Corporation and Scottish Aviation to form British Aerospace under the Aircraft and Shipbuilding Industries Act, which was an act of Parliament in the UK. And then the following year, this project was restarted as the BA146, and the first 100 series, so the shortest fuselage variant, first flew on the 3rd of September in 1981, followed about a year later by the first 200 series. That's a slightly stretched version, accommodating approximately 15 more passengers than the original one. And then it entered into service with Dan Air in the UK in 1983, and later on, I think, with Air Wisconsin in the United States. And during the 80s, they also developed a QT freighter version of the aircraft, a QC, so-called quick change version, which had seats on pallets which could roll back through the fuselage and then be removed through the cargo door. And the idea of that was you could operate your aircraft as a passenger aircraft during the day and then as a freight aircraft during the night and increase the utilization. And then there was the Statesman VIP variant. Several famous examples of that. The Queen's Flight, which became 32 Squadron in the Royal Air Force, operated this for many years. They were only retired in the last year or two. That's one you can go and see now in the museum in Duxford. The Formula One management organization for many years operated two VIP versions of the aircraft as well. And in 1987, they produced an ultimate stretched version of it, the 300 series, which first flew on the 1st of May 1987. They built a new assembly hall around this time at Hatfield. They had a problem up until then that the Hatfield factory, which went back to the 1930s when they were building little wooden biplanes, had a very low roof. So all the large jet aircraft that they'd been producing there up until then, in order to get them out or to move them along the line in the factory, they actually had to lift the nose to get the tail of the aircraft down in order to move it. There was, I think, one high bay at the end of the factory. But yeah, having this new assembly hall then was meant to expedite the final assembly of the airframes. In 1988, in July, then they made the first landing at London City Airport. So this actually proved to be very important because many airlines operated this aircraft type in and out of this airport, also other European city airports. But London City is almost unique in the sense that it has a 5.5 degree approach as opposed to a normal 3.3 degree approach because of the high buildings around it. This is actually a converted dock. So during the 1980s, they wanted to regenerate parts of East London, the docks that were no longer being used as the actual functioning docks moved ever east into the Thames estuary. And this became more or less the first jet aircraft that was certified to land here. So you actually need a special additional certification to operate any particular aircraft type in or out of London City because of the steep approach requirement. In the same year, they opened a second production line at the former Avro plant in Woodford near Manchester. And in 1990, Crossair, which was a former Swiss regional airline, received the first of 5 146 aircraft. And in this country, it gained the nickname Jumbolino, or Little Jumbo. And this seemed to stick, and I think many of the Swiss public knew it by this name. In 1992, British Aerospace announced the closure of the Hatfield site. So then the production continued only with final assembly at Woodford and Manchester. And around about the same time, they relaunched a slightly modernized version of it, which was then renamed to Avro RJ, RJ standing for regional jet. And this featured this 507 uprated engine and a fully electronic flight deck. So all the conventional dials and so forth being replaced by flat panels, and a new modernized passenger cabin, which was named Spaceliner. And so the shortest fuselage variant, the 100 series, became the RJ70, the 200 became the RJ85, and the 300 became the RJ100. And in 1993, the first RJ85 was delivered to Crossair, so they essentially decided to replace all of their 146s only after a couple of years with the newer version. And then in 2002, Swiss Air, which was the parent of Crossair, actually went bankrupt, and the new, or the current Swiss airline was actually formed out of the previous Crossair company. And they operated a total of 25 Avro RJs over their time, and the last of these was retired in 2017. Moving on, a few projected developments that never got into production. So in the mid-80s, they were thinking about how they might be able to move to 2 engines and to greater fuel efficiency. You see a couple of concepts there in the top left picture. On the left-hand side, a ducted fan concept, so aiming for a sort of high bypass ratio twin engine. And on the right-hand side, something that was a concept that was studied quite a lot in the 80s, the so-called open rotor, or at least that's the UK name. I think in the United States, it's known as an unducted fan. So where you've got relatively high bypass ratio and multiple contra-rotating fans. But this didn't really go any further. And then towards the end of the decade there, they also wanted to see if they could produce a military version of it. The so-called side-loading tactical airlifter, which was basically the freight version with a side opening door. But unfortunately, military operators, that wasn't really useful for them. They wanted really the rear loading. I think in a war zone or something, you can't really mess around with having things sort of loading in peculiar angles and so forth. And so there were no orders for this. Up until 1991, then they were looking again at a twin engine version with CFM56 engines. So this is basically the same engine you'd find on a 737 or an Airbus A320, still with a high wing, although they had a new wing with greater sweep angle, winglets, and leading edge high lift devices, slats and Kruger flaps. It would have had a flat panel cockpit with optional side stick fly-by-wire control like an Airbus. Not sure why this didn't proceed. It may be at that time they had a large shareholding in Airbus, and it may be that this was seen to conflict with the smaller Airbuses. Not quite sure why that didn't go ahead. And then they were still looking into the early 90s, possibly a cooperation with Taiwan to produce a new regional jet. And there's a picture there in the bottom right of a potential study there we see now with a new low wing and BMW Rolls-Royce 715 engines, conventional tail. And to me, the layout of that looks very much like the sort of regional jets we see nowadays from Airbus and from Embraer. They did produce well, they did try to produce a new version. So in 2000, they launched the Avro RJX, and they aimed here for really quite a modest update. So the main change was a switch to a new Honeywell AS977 engine. Honeywell was actually Allied Signal, having renamed itself, having acquired Honeywell. They already owned Garrett Air Research, and they purchased the Lycoming engine company, I think from Textron at some point in the past, and they'd merged these into their own business. So here they designed a new engine, which curiously actually I spotted has a lower bypass ratio than the previous one, 4.2 as opposed to 5.6, but it has quite a few other changes here. So we have a wide chord fan. There's no snubber, so you may have seen in the earlier picture there was a connector between the blades for added stiffness to sort of mitigate sort of vibration issues, that kind of thing, and that's not present here. And we've got only 4 axial stages, and again still this radial stage, but the overall pressure ratio has jumped right up to 28, so that indicates to me they're much higher loaded stages. The compressor is sort of straight through. You've got maybe, I think, one more turbine stage, and the gearbox has been eliminated. So these are sort of closer to a similar radius. Had a common exhaust nozzle, and again, it had the FADEC, the full authority digital engine control. So 3 of these were built and flight tested. But then, of course, after September 11th, 2001, what happened in New York, there was a quite substantial downturn in aviation. And BAE Systems at that point decided to cancel the program. There weren't that many orders, and one aircraft has been preserved, this one at Manchester Airport. So if you ever happen to go into Manchester, they have a little park there where you can see various aircraft, and this is one of them. So just to summarize, in the end, the last aircraft was delivered on the 26th of November 2003, which is actually the same day that Concorde last flew. A total of 392 were built, which makes it the most successful British jet airliner. So I've highlighted it in red here on my graph that shows most of the major post-war British civil aircraft. We see that 125 business jet, which was actually sold to Raytheon in the US in about 1993, went on. They sold something like 1,700 of those. So that, by far the most selling of all. and then we see a couple of turboprops. And in terms of other jet aircraft that were produced in Britain, the BAC 111 with 233, the Comet with 114, VC 10 only 54. I missed the Trident, it should be there somewhere. 117 of those, and Concorde with only 20. In the meantime, now most airlines in Europe and the US have withdrawn the 146 and the Avro RJ, so they're typically replaced by things like the Airbus A220, which was previously known as the Bombardier C series before Airbus bought it out, and the Embraer E-jets. It does continue to be used, notably in Iran, has a lot of them now. There are some in Canada, Australia, Chile, Libya, Philippines, and maybe a couple in Equatorial Guinea and Kyrgyzstan. But it does continue to be used in some places. Had it not been for the coronavirus pandemic, Airbus were planning to use one as a demonstrator or a technology demonstrator for an electrically driven engine. So they had one airframe that they acquired where they intended to replace the one inboard engine with a Siemens 2 megawatt electric motor driving the fan from a Rolls-Royce Allison AE3007, which would have had the electricity supplied by another Allison or Rolls-Royce turboshaft engine in the fuselage. But as I say, it was cancelled in 2020. The original prototype, which got stretched in 1987 to become the 300 series prototype, continues in the UK as the facility for airborne atmospheric measurements. So I think some kind of meteorological research aircraft. And in the US, they're actually collecting a lot of them now and converting them into fire bombers, so fighting forest fires. So actually, that concludes my presentation. So hope that was interesting. May have stimulated you perhaps to, next time you fly on the plane, to sort of question the various design features, you know, as you're passing the time as an engineer on a plane, and wonder why things are laid out and designed as they are.